My name is Judith Russell, and I'm delighted now to be able to introduce Alex Parrish, who I can see on the screen, which is always quite comforting. Alex, I understand, is doing a PhD at the moment at Garrett, and is going to speak to us on A Daughter of the Dawn, American Methodist women's dramas during the Barbara Heck Bicentennial. Thank you.
On Saturday, March 14th, 1936, the New York Times ran a short notice about the closing ceremony celebrating the 200th anniversary of Barbara Heck's birth at the historic John Street Church in New York City. Among the special guests of the event were two playwrights whose plays were performed during the bicentennial celebrations in the preceding years under the auspices of the Barbara Heck Bicentenary Commission of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Their names were Madeleine Sweeny Miller and Louisa Collier Culver. The plays memorialized Heck and were performed in various locations during the Heck Bicentennial. Barbara Heck's legend among American Methodists is due in large part to an oft-repeated but difficult to source story. Heck, along with other Irish Palatines, settled in New York in the early 1760s. The settlers lost some of the piety that they practiced in Ireland, culminating in an infamous card game among some men at leisure. Heck, disgusted by the sinfulness of her fellow settlers, promptly took up the cards and threw them into the flames in a nearby fireplace. Not content with burning the cards, Heck marched to her cousin, Philip Embry, the one-time spiritual leader of their community, and implored him to preach to them all again. Embry, convicted by the piety of his cousin Barbara, took up the preaching ministry once more, and with the Hecks, established a Methodist meeting house in New York, one of the first in America. This legend of bold women's piety was passed down through the generations of American Methodists and inspired the plays written during the Barbara Heck Bicentennial celebrations. This essay evaluates two plays and the roles of the dramas in the memory and mythology of Barbara Heck in American Methodism. The first play, Miller's A Daughter of the Dawn, a drama of early American Methodism, was a pageant about the life and legacy of Barbara Heck. The pageant presented Heck as a paragon of women's piety and situated her among the most significant mothers of the faith. The second play, Culver's Golden Hill, was a seriocomedy that presented a more down-to-earth Heck, the ideal Ladies' Aid Society leader, and an example for the everyday Methodist woman. The contrasting presentation of Heck in the plays offers an intriguing look into how the memory of Heck was used to spur women's faith and piety during the Heck Bicentennial. There are few scholarly works on Barbara Heck, and the lack of work is understandable. There are no extant manuscripts by her hand, and the narratives from her contemporaries focus on her cousin, Philip Embry. The source most often cited is Abel Stevens' 1866 book, The Women of Methodism, prepared for the American Methodist Ladies Centenary Association. Stevens waxed poetic about the struggle to narrate Heck's life, writing, quote, "So few are the remaining traditions of her personal history that it is impossible to construct from them any adequate or satisfactory sketch of her life and character. The foundress of Methodism in all these lands, she nevertheless appears amid the early startling events and ever-enlarging results of its history, like a star, apart from its surrounding orbs, occupying but the smallest point of space, yet shedding its streaming light over the whole hemisphere," end quote. The state of scholarship in 1866 has not improved in the last century and a half. Some genealogists have produced interesting accounts that shed light on the extension of the Heck family in Canada and Ireland and trace the traditional stories. These genealogies do not evaluate Heck's legacy, but do add to the evidence of the importance of Heck in communities on both sides of the Atlantic. Heck's legacy and historical memory are lore and legend, comprising second, third, and fourth-hand accounts. But Heck's mythology is itself a part of Methodist history. Stevens, continuing his flowery language, summed up this idea well when he wrote, quote, "Gems, says the proverb, are always small, and the magnitude of her record must chiefly consist of the setting of her precious name, made from the history of the great cause with which her memory is identified, more than from the history of her own life." End quote. The histories of American Methodism and Barbara Heck intertwined in the Barbara Heck Bicentennial, during which American Methodists celebrated Heck's 1734 birth. Scholarship on this bicentennial is virtually non-existent. In fact, beyond the essays in Methodist periodicals and the short articles in some newspapers during the bicentennial, I have been unable to uncover any work discussing the bicentennial after the 1930s. The transatlantic celebration of a significant Methodist woman offers exciting sources to evaluate the place and legacy of women in Methodism, and of Barbara Heck in particular. This essay is the first in a planned series of essays evaluating Heck's legacy in American Methodism, particularly among Methodist women. The Barbara Heck Bicentenary Commission was appointed at the General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church in May 1932, and was made up of 8 unpaid women from New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. As described in the General Conference Journal, the Commission's work was both broad and ambiguous. Quote, "To plan for a fitting commemoration by New York and worldwide Methodism in honor of the bicentenary of the birth of Barbara Heck," end quote. The Commission worked during the quadrennium between the General Conferences of 1932 and 1936, and focused on educational work in local societies and publications, meetings and addresses, and the plays that are the focus of this essay. A future essay will give a more robust examination of the Commission's work. The crown jewel of the Commission seems to be Miller's pageant, A Daughter of the Dawn, a drama of early American Methodism. It was first performed in January 1933 at John Street Church, and according to the Commission's final report at the 1936 General Conference, it was performed by many churches in the United States and Canada. The first performances of the play included a cast of 56 from 5 churches and expanded to 58 named cast members for a performance at the Metropolitan Life Insurance Auditorium on April 25, 1933. When the pageant was presented by the Religious Drama Council of the Greater New York Federation of Churches. The pageant's prologue was a 32-line poem read by a, quote, "young woman in flowing robe of classic Greek type," which cast Barbara Heck as one of the many, quote, "devout women of honorable estate, whom God inspired to be a, quote, shield of truth." The poem situated Barbara among the biblical Deborah, Ruth, Lydia, and Prissa, Saints Teresa of Avila, Catherine of Siena, Hilda of Whitby, and Bertha of Kent, and Susanna Wesley, the mother of John and Charles. The extraordinary faith and piety established in the poem was quickly demonstrated in the pageant's first episode. As the group of immigrants arrived in New York on August 11, 1760, the women of the party discussed the peril of the journey and Barbara's unique strength. One woman said, quote, "Barbara, you were so wonderful to us through every storm. Even when the waves seemed mountain high, your calm strength comforted us," end quote. Another said, quote, and when we were sick, oh, so sick, you comforted us all. What poise you have, what faith, end quote. Barbara sourced her strength in the Bible she carried. Moments later, as Philip Embry pontificated on the opportunities of New York, and some women wondered where they were to find shelter, Barbara's focus was on the, quote, "opening we shall have here to witness our love of God," end quote. The episode established themes that repeated through the rest of the pageant, where the men focused on prosperity and the other women focused on comfort. Barbara focused on the promises of Scripture and the witness of the faith in the New World. Episode 2 recounted the infamous card game and the establishment of a Methodist congregation. In one scene, Barbara confronted Philip Embry over the worldliness of the settlers, which Philip hesitated to address. Barbara, confounded with Philip's ambivalence, scolded him, quote, "You have done nothing. You have fallen back upon quiet inactivity. Shall I be forced to call you a backslider?" End quote. She opened her Bible to Judges chapter 4, the story of hesitant Barak and the bold prophetess Deborah, and she said, quote, "Ah, here was a mighty woman who led a hesitant man to the warfare of the Lord," end quote. Philip and Barbara read the story together, and Philip exclaimed, quote, "Oh, Barbara, once again in the course of God's unfolding plans has woman been the stirrer up of man, his challenger, inspiring him to act," end quote. With more prodding by Barbara, a Methodist congregation met in Philip's carpentry workshop. Episode 3 covered the inclusion of Captain Webb, an English military leader, into the Little Methodist community. Barbara cast the vision for a house of worship and suggested certain designs that were cost-effective and strategic, such as building a fireplace so the building could be classed as domestic architecture and thereby circumvent the sanctions some dissenting churches faced. The episode is notable for its presentation of Barbara not only as a spiritual architect, but a physical architect of the building. Philip Embry may have been the preacher and the carpenter, and Captain Webb may have been the bankroll, but it was Barbara Heck who cast the vision for the house of worship and considered the ways it would best serve the congregation. Episode 4 flashed to the latter days of Barbara's life. The Hecks were in Ontario, Canada, where they had lived as loyalists since the days of the American Revolution. The episode also focused on the budding romance between one of Heck's daughters and a young man planning to become a Methodist circuit rider. She told the story of the family's journeys to her grandchild. Here, the multifaceted legacy of Heck is most evident. As a mother and grandmother, she saw her descendants live faithfully and extend the family's Methodist heritage in North America. As her daughter said in the closing lines, quote, "Our children's children shall see Methodist missionaries sailing to distant ports of which we have not even dreamed." But Barbara also recognized her unique position among women of the faith. The episode closed with Barbara asleep in a chair. As she slept, a soloist sang a new version of the song Saint Barbara, a tune once included in the Methodist hymnal about the legendary martyr. The epilogue, titled An Armchair Dream, featured a, quote, processional of great-souled women who walked across the stage and lit a candle from the stick beside a still sleeping Barbara. The women included the philanthropist Eliza Garrett, the poet Fanny Crosby, the missionary Isabella Thoburn, the temperance crusader Frances Willard, and an anonymous deaconess, a church school teacher, a Christian nurse, a social worker, a Christian businesswoman, a mother, a woman preacher, and foreign women, quote, won by those who have pioneered for Christ, end quote. Culver's Golden Hill was written in 1935 for the commission, though its reach and fanfare were more limited. Where A Daughter of the Dawn was a large pageant written for church performances, Golden Hill was designed especially for women's organizations, large or small, with a cast of 10 to 18 ladies, 3 girls, and 2 boys. Given that its target audience was ladies' aid societies, sources discussing the performance of the play are limited. The play contained contemporary and historical scenes. The primary characters were not Barbara Heck and her companions, but a local ladies' aid society meeting at the home of a member. The names and descriptions of the Ladies' Aid Society characters demonstrate the comical nature of their scenes. Mrs. Baker, hostess to the Ladies' Aid Society. Mrs. Frost, cool toward any new idea. Mrs. Armstrong, jolly stout lady. Miss Mann, businesslike. Mrs. Nichols, treasurer. Mrs. Elder, elderly lady. Mrs. Wright, secretary. Mrs. Abel, president. And Mrs. Waite, hesitant and always late. The first act of the 3-act play was set during a contemporary Ladies' Aid Society meeting. The members arrived and convened to discuss the business of a usual meeting, reports of the secretary, treasurer, etc. The ladies then discussed their study of early American Methodism, which focused on the Palatine immigrants who settled in New York. They covered the standard story of Embry and Heck, including the card game, Barbara's appeals to Philip, and the gathering of the community into one of the first Methodist congregations in America. The first act set up the dramatic scenes of the second act, which shifted from the Ladies' Aid Society meeting to a midweek prayer service in April 1770 at a residence near John Street Church in New York City. In the first scene, women and children visited one another as the congregation left the prayer meeting. It was revealed that Barbara's family and some others would be leaving the congregation soon to head north to Albany, New York. The families reminisced on some of the events of the past years at Golden Hill. Barbara suggested to the group of women that the soon-to-be vacant residence should be converted into a house for itinerant preachers, and that the women organize a, quote, kind of ladies' aid society, end quote, to furnish it. The second scene showed a few members of the new Ladies' Aid Society at work in the residence a few weeks after Barbara left. As the scene ended, one of the women remarked, quote, I hope the ladies that follow after us in this good work will realize that they have a duty to perform that only they can do well, end quote. Act 3 returned to the contemporary Ladies' Aid Society 1 month after the events of Act 1. The women were at work preparing furnishings and goods for their church's parsonage. Inspired by the spirit of the early American Methodist women, the Ladies' Aid Society redoubled their efforts in acts of service for the local church and community. They also voted to meet regularly with the Women's Home and Foreign Missionary Societies as a means of uniting the ladies' work of their church so that they had a wider range of interests. The women agreed that the study of the past inspired their renewed energy. As the play ended, the women considered the importance of John Street Church in American Methodist history and agreed the church required some restoration, to which one member asserted, quote, we need another Barbara Heck to get busy and show us our duty, end quote. The two plays demonstrate the ways Barbara Heck's legend was used to inspire American Methodist women. A Daughter of the Dawn elevated Heck's distinctiveness. Though the pageant noted she was a wife, mother, and grandmother, and though it showed her spiritual legacy through the lives of everyday deaconesses, nurses, social workers, businesswomen, mothers, preachers, missionaries, and converts, the emphasis is on Barbara Heck as the paragon of women's piety and a unique figure in the roster of the mothers of the faith. Though her piety was not unique, her place was. As Barbara said to her granddaughter at the close of episode 4, quote, it has been the privilege of many women in centuries gone by to guide the feet of little ones in the path of righteousness. But few women have had the privilege God has given me to stand at the dawn of spiritual life in 2 great countries and guide them into a hopeful future. Only eternity will tell the influences which will result from these humble efforts, end quote. Conversely, Golden Hill elevated Heck's everyday faithfulness. While Heck's singular contributions were remembered, it was her faithful presence in the community in the years after her appeal to Embry that inspired the women to directly continue her legacy. As one fictional member of the Ladies' Aid Society remarked, quote, I fear sometimes that we think of Barbara Heck only as the one who aroused Philip Embry to his duty, when we should also remember what an inspiration she was to the little society for many years after that, end quote. In addition to the themes of the plays, the medium itself offers a unique view into the way Barbara Heck's legend was passed to a new generation. In her 1997 essay, Pageantry at the Methodist Centenary, Nancy Van Brunt called attention to how American Methodists accepted theatrical productions in the first decades of the 20th century as legitimate means to promote and celebrate their heritage. It should not be overlooked that A Daughter of the Dawn was performed in a secular venue like the Metropolitan Life Insurance Auditorium. Nor should the performances of A Daughter of the Dawn and Golden Hill by and in churches be overlooked. Churches participated in the story of Barbara Heck in giving the performances, and women in particular took center stage in the performances. They were stories about Methodist women, written by Methodist women, performed in large part by Methodist women, during a transatlantic celebration spearheaded by Methodist women. While A Daughter of the Dawn received the most recognition, Golden Hill perhaps had the most influence after the Heck Bicentennial. As mentioned earlier, Golden Hill ended with the Ladies' Aid Society discussing the preservation work to be done at the John Street Church. In the final report of the Barbara Heck Bicentennial Commission to General Conference in 1936, the commission reported that a new women's organization had been founded to preserve certain elements of John Street Church. The name of that organization was the Golden Hill Society.
Well, thank you, Alex, for a fascinating insight into the different ways a remarkable woman has been remembered. I'm going to open up the floor and ask for questions. Yeah, Tim. Yeah.
Thank you, Alex, for that fascinating talk. I'm interested, I am interested in Barbara Heck and the person, and I'm interested in the media by which the anniversary was celebrated. But I think there's a prior question also as to why the anniversary was celebrated, and particularly the way that anniversaries are celebrated within the life of Methodism, both British and American and global Methodism. I mean, why do we celebrate or commemorate in 1938 and 1988 the conversion of the Wesleys? Why did we put so much emphasis on the birth of John 1703 and Charles 1707? Why did we do all that in terms of how did those anniversaries connect with the mission and purpose of the Methodist churches celebrating those at the time? That's the prior question that I'd like you to explore with us, or to encourage you to explore.
Thank you, Tim. Those are great questions. I asked myself those as well. As I said in the paper, this is the first of a series of essays that explores particularly Barbara Heck's legacy. But that question that you've asked has been at the back of my mind of what is this impulse within Methodism in particular to have these kind of celebrations. Methodism's not necessarily unique in memorializing figures in its religion, but I think we can all agree Methodists have a unique way of memorializing people and spreading these narratives and legends of key figures. So I don't have a satisfactory answer to your question at the moment, but it is one that I am exploring further and connecting Barbara Heck's Bicentennial to other events. Abel Stevens' book, The Women of Methodism, for instance, was written to commemorate a different event about the history of women in Methodism. So it's a very interesting question that has lots of places to study, and I look forward to sharing those in the future.
Anyone else? So I suspect, Alex, that my question is going to demonstrate how little I knew about Barbara Heck until your paper. I mean, it strikes me from what you've told us that there's a large element of things being read into her history. Is this? This is something about the fact that she's quite iconic, but I'm taking it from your paper that she's a name that everybody knows, but actually there's just that single story that everybody knows about her. Does that sound fair?
That's a pretty accurate description. So the famous story is the cards. What started this whole project in my office at Drew, outside of it, there is a poster from the end of the 19th century that it was a painting of Barbara Heck throwing the cards into the fire. We also have postcards that memorialize this. So I was very interested in why does it matter that cards were thrown into the fire as this kind of watershed moment in American Methodism. And it led down this very interesting rabbit hole to this commission that I knew nothing about. And part of the project, as you saw in the footnotes, because you have the footnotes, is actually tracing the origins of this story and the ways the story has been split and reinterpreted, and how it was used by Methodists. There is a really strong tradition of Barbara Heck postcards that people would send, which we've collected at Drew University. But the commission produced 16 postcards at the end of the quadrennium, and these were produced at John Street Church. And I'm currently working with the church to figure out where those 16 postcards are. All this to say, the history has been, as you said, read into quite a bit. And the question now is not, is it true, or are these stories accurate? But it's, where did they start and how were they used at various points? And the story really takes off in the mid 19th century, and historians start debating at the time the details of these. So somebody suggests Philip Embry was actually playing cards with the group, which would be quite a scandal in the story, and others disagree. But tracing the origins of this story has been even more interesting than the work that I was doing on this. And I'm hoping to, in a future seminar, give the definitive report of where this story started. I have some good ideas, but I want to trace those before sharing them a little further.
Indeed, and there are also just always interesting parallels with figures where we really have a single story, but we like to build an entire history on that. So fascinating. Thank you. Any other questions? If I'm not cutting us off, then I think I will say thank you very much, Alex, for a fascinating paper.